Welcome to our public lecture series, number 2 for the 2025 to 2026 of the spring term. Before we begin, may I first invite our school director, Peter Fredo, to make the opening remarks. Thank you.
Hello everyone and welcome. So, I wrote this on a plane from Sydney to Hong Kong, so I don't know how much it makes sense. But very happy to have Ingrid here. Ingrid is a long-time friend back from the years where we used to study together at Cambridge. And I've just written a little thing that I think I'll just read out for everybody. Very pleased to introduce Ingrid Schroder, Director of the Architecture Association in London. Ingrid is a long-time friend and has visited our school in many capacities, also as an external examiner in the past. This is the second public lecture this semester that we have under the theme of architecture and agency, which coincidentally is also the theme of our architectural master's program, which the director Francesco Rossini is running, and I think will lead and segue to a conversation later about what is happening in education. Ingrid studied at architecture at the Cambridge University, where I first met her, and like so many others in the room, share a connection with an influential teacher called Peter Carl, who shaped very much the way I think, and I can say we, see, read, understand, and relate to architecture. I see this passion in the way that Ingrid teaches and also researches and practices architecture as Peter did through what I call osmosis. It's a way that you feel it through the passion that the person has towards architecture, and it's something that I think is very difficult to teach. It's something that you learn by being in the presence of that person. Ingrid became the director of the Architecture Association in 2022. Before that, she was the head of design at teaching at Cambridge University, where she also taught for 20 years MPhil, and being the director of the MPhil and the UD programs. But there is one story that unites Ingrid to this school, and particularly to me also, is the fact in 2026 we co-taught a student from this school called Thomas Chi, who did an exchange in Cambridge and was the first student from outside of the UK to win the RIBA silver medal. So that was a unique moment, and I remember going to the RIBA, collecting it with Ingrid and Thomas. So that was a very special moment. Besides running the AA, Ingrid's research focuses on new pedagogical models, climate change, architecture of the American Revolution, and African Modernism. On my phone, and then just before the Wi-Fi disconnected, it says the title of Ingrid's PhD's topic, which I was absolutely unknown to me, was Washington, D.C. and the idea of America, a reappraisal of the 1791 plan of the nation's capital. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what Wi-Fi told me on the plane. Ingrid is strongly committed to architecture and how we teach it, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome her today to our school. Thank you very much, Ingrid.
Thank you, Peter. Goodness, that's a fantastic introduction. Maybe I'll start by a few words about my rogue PhD. Something I never talk about, but actually the idea of how the spaces that we create, either through landscape or urbanism, reflect and are impacted by decisions around political organizations, I think couldn't be more relevant than it is now. Perhaps one day I will come back here and tell you the story of George Washington and how it's shaped the renewal of monarchy, perhaps within an American context, but we'll leave that for another day. Today, what I really want to talk to you about is all of the things that concern me about where education is going. Now, we are at a moment of real transition, and I keep on being asked about what makes the AA relevant and radical in the 21st century. I had a sort of heated discussion with one of our alumni on Friday night, who was sort of asking me, where are the Peter Cooks and the Zaha Hadids coming from, and why aren't they coming out of the AA? And my argument is that they're not coming out of anywhere, and that's a good thing. We are beyond the era of the starchitect, of the single figure that leads a vision, and we are moving into a much more collective and collaborative understanding of how we shape space. But of course, we're loaded with this very particular idea of what is new and what should be new, and the extent to which architecture and the shaping of space needs to continue being forever new. So I'm starting here with, really questioning what the new avant-garde is. Certainly when I came to the school, and I've got some faces like Jeroen who know the school well, the AA talks about its radicalism endlessly. So apparently we are, innovating, we are challenging, and we are the rebels of architecture. And yet we're housed in this incredible set of buildings. So the school was founded in 1847, so we're coming up on our 180th anniversary next year. And we're housed in a row of Georgian terrace houses that are grade 1 listed, which is about as bad as it gets, so we can touch almost nothing. So we teach in a series of tiny little rooms in a domestic space in the middle of London. So how do we stay rebellious, and what does that really mean? So this is the frontage of the school with the various blue plaques. So here we are, rebels in an old house. This is an image from the very beginning. We started in Bedford Square in 1919, which is the first year we admitted women. This is not, I think, a student, I believe, but simply someone who is being painted by men. Now, I think what's interesting about this is that this is a traditional environment, but it is formed out of the idea that architecture should be a conversation. Before this, in London, certainly the way in which people qualified as architects was through an apprenticeship system. So you went and you worked with a practice. And that was interesting. It's interesting because actually that idea has been renewed, and there's a great trend towards really experience design through practice and through learning, sort of on the job. But at the time, it was considered to be vulnerable to levels of exploitation, of young people, of corruption within the kind of the architectural profession. And these three characters got together, and he said, perhaps architectural education, and what's missing is a discussion, an academic discussion, and a discussion about ideas. They met in a pub, they then met in other small rooms, and eventually in the spaces that now are number 32 to 39, it used to be 34 and 36, Bedford Square. And this is the legacy of the school. And so out of that tradition, you get these big names. Friotto was involved, obviously Zaha Hadid, who's the anniversary of her death will be honored in a few days. Richard Rogers, Ron Arad, David Chipperfield, Nigel Coates, Rem Koolhaas, and people like Neri Oxman. So these are big names. They're promoted. They are visible within the press. They've produced extraordinary pieces of work and advanced the ideas within architecture. Many of them, if they're still alive, are quite old. Here we have behind this the kind of environment that I think prompted the exuberance and the possibility for experimentation that the AA is so well known for. This is, strangely enough, John Pawson, who I'm sure you know as someone who's deeply concerned with materials, is the classic sort of minimalist. When you look up British minimalism, you get John Pawson. Here he is giving a nice kiss to Ron Arad, who is probably the least minimal in many, many ways. This is the life, this is the community that was cultivated, I would say, in the 80s in the AA bar. And out of these small spaces, from people like John Pawson, Ron Arad, Nigel Coates, Zaha Hadid, etc., comes again a spirit of collective confrontation of the now, a confrontation of approach that I think has been vital to the way in which the AA has shaped architects, really, at least for the last, I would say, 50 years. Debate is central to the establishment of a position. And I think what we have done very well, and I hope we still do, is to encourage people not to agree, to disagree with respect, and to understand how they describe their position through the work that they produce. Of course, in its heyday, in the 80s and 90s, this is the kind of, I suppose from the 70s through the 90s, this enabled people to produce work, to produce drawings, models, writing, and eventually projects that were highly contested and in deep opposition to one another. This kind of oppositional standpoint became the core of the way in which what was the unit system, and still is the unit system, operated as a kind of culture of dispute. I think this is an interesting one to question. I hope we get a chance to talk about this later today. But the idea of dispute as being a creative practice is something that I think we've lost, for better or for worse. The idea that we have to disagree and we have to do that vehemently is not something that is within our current lexicon. We are a culture of consensus. We are a culture of compromise. And out of that, obviously, stems a degree of respect and thoughtful engagement. But perhaps it also dilutes the emphasis and of position-taking, the individual creativity that sits behind these ideas. So the extent to which we have to agree, I think, is something that is necessarily up for debate. As a second stage, what I really wanted to talk about is the nature of making and the way in which ideas are articulated through the projects that we produce. I want to say about 6 months ago, maybe more. I'm starting losing track of time, but we had an amazing lecture by Chrysalis. Now, Chrysalis you will have never heard of because they only existed for a handful of years, but it was a practice and a company founded by Mike Davies, who was a founding partner with Richard Rogers, of the Richard Rogers Partnership, and Alan Stanton, who went on to form Stanton Williams. They were two young architects who had graduated from the AA, and they went off to Los Angeles. They went off, and they, in the kind of late 60s, early 70s, and they found that they could take new materials out of the skips and dumps of the aeronautical industry. So they were finding incredible membranes, they were finding extraordinary materials, and they were inventing. They produced a lot of inflatables. They found ways of making impossible spaces work. Now, apparently, I need some evidence of this, but apparently Mike Davies invented the inflatable man that you see outside of sort of car showrooms in America, that kind of creature, the sort of tube man that does this, which I think is obviously, if that's his claim to fame, that's fantastic. But what they did and what this image represents is just one of their projects, which is a complete sphere, a reflective sphere that was built for basically a movie set. Now, they experimented with weather balloons, they experimented with other inflatable structures, but to get a material that could actually create reflection without distortion, that could sustain itself, that could sustain the vacuum essentially created by the inflatable with people in it, was an incredible technical kind of conundrum. This is the sort of thing that they were working on before they were all called to by Richard Rogers, who just won the Pompidou. So they say that they left California, which was, a balmy, however many, 30 degrees. When they landed in Paris to work with Richard Rogers on Pompidou, it was, I think, -9. So that was the end of a wonderful kind of holiday of experimentation. And the reason I talk about this is I think the legacy of the way in which people solve problems through the making of architecture at one-to-one is instrumental in the way in which this particular period of architectural history was shaped, and is something that has slightly been lost to us for a very particular set of reasons. Now, at the time, obviously, there's an incredible interest in the way in which one can create using kind of certain technologies, inventions within structural design, the use of small components, the way in which physical experimentation could lead to very, very large-scale architectural form through the work of Konrad Waxman, through Buckminster Fuller, through Frei Otto. It's also then informed by the work of people like Cedric Price. So if one understands that in the 60s and 70s, the idea that space could become undesignated, that the advances in technology and the advances in making could make for an unprogrammed environment, a space that is kind of infinitely free, is flexible, starts to actually have a particular relevance to what we do now. These ideas are translated obviously into projects like the Pompidou Center, which then I think give way to some kinds of high-tech projects that people like Rogers are known for. I think the inventiveness of coming out of making crazy blow-ups for the movie industry in LA, the fact that that has moved decades on to something like Barajas Airport is a huge leap, of a kind of intellectual leap. But I think that the seeds of that kind of architecture sit within the capacity to make. Here we have, on the left, we have Mike Davies, who's the one who was involved in Chrysalis, who at some point when he was living in France, decided to only wear red. Apparently he started out with only wearing purple, but in the early 70s that sort of signified something else, so he started only wearing red, and he wears only red up to this day. There's another sort of silly story that I'll let you take with you, where he said when they were first working in Paris, there was a guy who said, "Why are you all obsessed with fromage, with cheese?" He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're always going fromage, fromage, fromage." He said, "Well, how?" He says, "Every time you go, cheeses, cheeses." So anyway, so if you ever want to, swear, you can just remember cheeses. Anyhow, so all of this work, I think, although it is operating at a very particular point in time with an interest in the space race, in new technologies, in the way in which out of small components we can make infinite spaces. Fundamentally, this comes out of a culture of tinkering, of making, of experimentation. The conversation we had that night with Mike Davies and Alan Stanton was very much about the culture that they had grown up in. So they were interested in model trains. They were taking apart radios. They were putting things together. They were tinkering. They were playing with form. They were playing with technologies. They were taking things apart and putting them back together. And out of that spirit, you get a way in which people are trying to understand the possibilities of the things that they find around them. In this case, the very familiar Buckminster Fuller Dome, but also a version that was done at Black Mountain College. In fact, there's, I think, Louise de Koenig in one of these images, and they're trying to make a Buckminster Fuller Dome out of Venetian blinds. So again, the thing that you find that is kind of rigid but awkward in the wrong direction, finding a way to make structure in a new way. Again, this may seem only peripherally relevant to what we do in architecture at the moment, but this was something that had tremendous reach. So the people who were involved in projects like this then also formed the Department of Tropical Architecture at the AA, which was a course that was coming out of the work of Max Frey and Jane Drew of Otto Königsberger, who are really looking at the possibilities of how vernacular architectures can actually respond to climate extremes. So how do we learn from the familiar? How do we understand the material use and the volumetric use of space in order to create comfort? It's the very basis of kind of the environmental design. It has a tremendous influence. But it was also about engagement with the Global South, the opportunities to collaborate with places like KNUST and Kumasi in Ghana, and to create a dialogue, a north-south, south-north dialogue that has informed the way in which essentially modern ideas, the ideas of modernity, then kind of drove a lot of the independence movements in places like sub-Saharan Africa. Again, I'm tapping into a body of research and interest that I've held for a long time. Again, this is about how do the origins and the experimentation and the way in which we shape space are intrinsically linked to ideas at this stage of new nationhood, of liberation. Architecture is an expression of ideas. But what's happening here is, again, how do you work with the familiar? How do you work with students through the making, through the tinkering, through the experimentation, to bring ideas across continents, to bring collaborations, again, through fabrication that remain essential. This kind of work, I think, then becomes really instrumental in the high-tech movement. I mean, obviously, I've mentioned Richard Rogers, Alan Stanton, etc. Michael and Patty Hopkins, they're a sort of second kind of generation. But the work that they do has, I think, had its own bearing on the work that follows it. So people like 6A, Tom Emerson, his work with the MK Gallery is learning directly from this generation of people who are trying to produce work that is light. work that sits lightly on the ground, work that responds to a kind of new materialism that is delicate, that is fabricated in a way that is visible. It's a whole tradition in architecture that is interesting within a current environmental crisis, in that we assume that being responsible and the use of natural materials needs to necessarily be heavy, that we use kind of timber structures or we use earth structures in order to be responsible, regenerative, and considerate within the context of a changing climate. But there's an interesting counter-argument and a resurgence around the work of the kind of the high-tech, which this component, this modular architecture that again sits lightly on the earth, the lightness has a particular environmental impact. The lighter materials then also require kind of less concrete being poured into the ground, etc. So there's a tremendously interesting way in which an architecture that comes out of a couple guys as kids sitting at their kitchen table, taking things apart and putting them back together, informs decades of new architecture that is concerned with the demountable, the reusable, the modular, and the delicate and the light. To bring this to the current day, this is a project of Max Hacker and Gustav Dösing, a study pavilion in Berlin, which won the 2024 Mies Award. To me, this is a kind of exact inheritor of the world of Michael and Patty Hopkins, of the work of people like Tom Emerson at 6A, and ultimately goes back to those early experimentations that were happening in the 60s and 70s about how do we make things out of small components. But all of this, again, goes back to the care of fabrication, of understanding the way in which we put things together as being an essential way of not only addressing things like climate change, but also addressing the means of production, the idea of communal labor, and a kind of a new old. So perhaps this is one form of radicalism, one form of the avant-garde, one way in which a sensitive response to the site, an understanding of a flexible use of space, and a delicate and gentle way of treating the ground is possible. This is one avenue, and of course there are others. Out of this kind of world of imposed modernism, we have postmodernism. And I can't think of perhaps a looser term, I'm never quite sure what it means, but we can speculate, that has its origins or has such a strong bearing on the world of the AA and the way in which it's kind of found new ways of thinking about how we move forward. If someone like Irene Skelber and Tom Emerson talk about being never modern, the AA is occasionally talking about being never postmodern, being liberal, and then occasionally in the work of people like Patrick Schumacher, libertarian. But the idea of freedom is something that is also intrinsic to our radicalism. The association with how we can be avant-garde has everything to do with how we liberate ourselves from the ideas that have come before, how we stop relying on everything that we see around us, how we are inventive. And obviously one of the key avenues of this that actually moves quite far away from ideas around fabrication is obviously the kind of early work of people like Bram Koolhaas, the drawings of Madeleine Vriesendorp, and the way in which they really embraced America. There's a fantastic interview with the two of them that coincided with an exhibition of basically Madeleine's work in the Guggenheim in the 70s, where they talk about the lack of kind of planning. So the idea that sort of anything can happen anywhere, and there's the lack of regulation, the kind of free-for-all that typified the US during this period, becoming, the possibility of doing anything. So out of that chaos, you get the ability to reflect a level of complexity in the world, to test ideas, to find ways in which you move out of this kind of modern straitjacket of zoning, of hierarchies, etc., into which one can start to impose a very different view of the world. I would be remiss, as we're, I think, a week away from the anniversary of Zaha's passing, not to mention her work, particularly her work here, addressing Hong Kong. I think that this is another avenue that is important within architectural education. Now, you might despair and you think, okay, it would be really helpful if Ingrid stood up and told us her singular view on architecture is architectural education, what we should be doing. As I am both representing myself and also the AA, we have always been about pluralism. We've always been about 4 or 5 ideas that sit alongside each other, often incompatibly. But fundamentally, they're describing a similar impetus or a similar drive towards understanding and making sense of the complexity of the world. Fundamentally, I think, as architectural educators, and I really felt I got this from people like Peter Carl, is that the complexity of the everyday, the complexity of the globe, of history, of the extraordinary ways in which people have resolved complex problems is an unreconcilable problem and not one we necessarily need to fix. And I think in the work, the kind of early work of people like Zaha Hadid, there was an ambition to capture that irreconcilability, the complexity of both the physical realm, the social realm, the historical realm, to begin to capture the kind of dynamism, the past and the future and the present, in forms of representation that suggested a new form of architecture. So it's not just shape making. It's not just the work that her projects then became, this being the Maxi Gallery, and then probably in the kind of later stages, towards the end of her own career, work that is highly involved in kind of computational, kind of digital design. But again, if we think about what this is a way in which we're essentially trying to capture and understand a very, very complex, layered set of lived experiences. I'll get onto this, and this is a bit of a leap, but bear with me. What kind of computational design is doing is reconciling a set of often layered intelligences, layered modes of movement, layered dynamisms, layered materials. This is, I think, a very beautiful image from FOA's Yokohama Ferry Terminal project, which has, I think, gone through its own anniversary last year. This is work that I think is relevant to how we also move forward, and I'll come to this in a bit. The relationship between the fabricated world, the collective making of things, the way in which we understand materials, is at one end of the spectrum. Perhaps at the other end of the spectrum is how we understand an increasingly digital environment, how we understand the value of computational thinking. The two are not entirely incompatible. I think what is interesting about both is both assume a level of collectivity. If you speak to people who are involved actively in the development of artificial intelligence, the idea is that this, of course, is a means of collective knowledge. It's a means of channeling and democratizing the way in which we interact with information. Ultimately, computational design is also about an open-endedness. So when you design through computational thinking, you don't have an answer. The answer is unknown. What's interesting about this is that we are entering a new era where computational design is not so much about shape making or even place making. It's about understanding the forces there are at play on a global sphere. So I know we have at least one graduate from DIP 4 in the room, but this is just a screenshot from last year's projects review from Diploma 4, which is John Palmasino and Anne-Sophie Rönskrog. They run a territorial agency, and they are looking at the influences of major factors as they affect whole regions. So water sources, contamination, the use of sand, the way in which whole realms are influencing or influenced by climate change. And what's interesting about this is that they're using essentially remote sensing technologies. They are visualizing data. They are working as designers and as understandings of space with these layered intelligences, the things that affect our everyday, that are unseen, but are instrumental in the way in which we function. And my interest is that somehow we begin to understand how we move from that vast scale of global thinking, of large language models, large data models, back through to how they start to influence our everyday. Again, going back to the complexity of the everyday as it has its repercussions, its multi-scalar ripples across the scales and across the globe. Some of this then also kind of starts to evolve into new forms of kind of digital expression. This is a project from a third-year student from a few years ago, who's looking at the implications of essentially an e-commerce based on the re-greening of a city in the Philippines and what that might mean. It is a huge speculation. It is using essentially digital technologies to world build, to envisage an entirely different reading of society, an entirely new reading of the future. Again, this is one version of how we need to understand design speculation. Design speculation may be experimentation, as I was talking about earlier, making, building, thinking, working together. At the other end of the spectrum, new digital technologies enable us to create whole environments that work in a fictive realm in order to speculate about the implications of new approaches. In this world, and I think is why I always use it as a series of slides, not only are these the mechanisms that enable a city to become a green and abandoned, rewilded environment, but it also starts to talk about the people left behind. So we go from something highly speculative, future-orientated, digitally orientated as well, or fabricated, down to the understanding that whenever we have big dreams, there are people who are left behind on the ground. So at the end, you can find this on our sort of projects review website, but there's a wonderful animation that goes through from this sort of wonderful vision, again, through to the people who are repairing the machines, tending to the technologies, who are, again, those of the kind of the informal settlements as they get left behind. And understanding that spectrum I think is critical to the way in which we teach and the way in which we practice in an era of rapid climate change. And what I wanted to reinforce in terms of kind of what this new avant-garde may be is the possibility that craft, be that crafting with your hands or even crafting with a computer, has to, for me, be an approach that is considered avant-garde. So it's not simply about the outrage or the exuberance or the new shape or the new form or being the kind of the loudest in the room, but really what is it to make well? If we make well, whatever tools that we use, I think we contribute to a conversation that is always moving forward. Moving to the complete other end of the spectrum, if I go from the absolute, the visions of Bo and Tan back to the visions of Field and Fowles. Now, these two are close to my heart because I taught both of them in their first year, and then Ed ended up at the AA. Now, what's interesting is Ed Fowles was taught by Carlos Villanueva Brandt, who they don't do buildings. They do a kind of community action, direct action. They look at the effects of policy on urbanism. It's a lot of I'm looking at people like Jeroen, who knows him well. It's nowhere near the making of spaces, and yet. Ed and Fergus, they made a practice that is highly concerned with the good use of materials. They do a lot with timber structures. They do a lot with the very, very careful use of very traditional materials. This is a project they did for the Natural History Museum. And just the attention to detail, the refined way in which they are working with stone, the way in which they're working with timber, and the way in which they are essentially crafting a magnificent, very tiny set of objects that enable something very small to be in communication with this, this extraordinary museum, the Natural History Museum in London, which in its own right is a highly crafted work of, I think in its own time, of enormous exuberance. This is the kind of the new youth. These are the people who I think, although you might not look at their work as radical, are responding radically through a level of responsibility. So that responsibility then carries through to understanding and being sensitive to how one may work with materials, what you leave in the earth and on the earth. I hope, bears some similarity, but this is doing something very similar, but in a very, very temporary and low-cost manner. The work of Takeshi Hayatsu, who's working also with Assemble. This is essentially a pop-up in Bermondsey that is, again, using very simple materials to create a place of delight, to create a community event a focal point for participation that is both literally shiny and then something that people can actually engage with. It's not just a tent in the middle of a public square. It is something with dignity. It's something with dignity that can be fabricated quickly, inexpensively, but has a sort of presence within a site that is all about care. Care is something that, obviously care takes time, but also care is also free. And what I love about the work that Takeshi does with his students is that he's using very traditional, in many cases, kind of Japanese timber techniques to articulate and embellish very commonplace materials. Here, by creating this kind of foil ornamentation on the interior of this pavilion for the Stanley Pickler Gallery, to me, he's beginning to reflect some of the more exuberant projects of people like OMA. The Casa de Musica, where the patterning on the plywood then becomes gilded in order to elevate, again, this very banal material. Again, I'm going back to Tom and 6A, but the possibility of looking again at something like cast iron and making a whole facade. This is something where people are going and working with craftsmen, reenacting, rejuvenating often lost skills in order to, again, dignify the place, dignify the street within the city. Similarly at the V&A. And then what follows from this is an experimentation with materials, the work of people like Asif Khan and Biomason, looking at biocement shelving, finding ways in which one can start to be inventive, to bring simple materials to make extraordinary spaces that have deeper meaning. And again, going back to more traditional techniques of ceramics. I think Adam Nathaniel Furman and his work in terms of decorative ceramic is extraordinary and comes out of a fantastical vision, again with a reference to the Casa de Musica, that is a deeply vernacular, deeply traditional craft, reinvented for new purposes. The other kind of call to arms that is important within architecture at the moment is not building. So much of the world is already built. I think that John Palmacino and Anne-Sophie, when they were curating the Lisbon Triennale, their whole theme was how heavy is the city? And I think something like if you demolished all buildings on Earth, you would have, I think, something like a meter of building rubble that would cover the entire globe. We are so deeply responsible for what we put in the earth and on the earth moving forward in an overly, very, very heavily constructed environment. How much more do we need? There's been so many projects that have taken this on, and it's often something I don't like talking about in a school of architecture because we want all of you to be free, to test, to try, to be adventurous. But fundamentally, when we get out in the world, we have to question how much more we need to do. And there's a fantastic set of projects like the Neues Museum, which is now pretty old, which is about the very, very careful understanding of very, very sort of sensitive and micro interactions and introductions of new materials, the repair of the old, the forensic review of what is already existing. And this also goes for cities. Certainly, if we look within a European context, perhaps the city's finished. Perhaps we've built enough. Perhaps actually we've left behind whole chunks of former housing, of former factory spaces that need nothing more. So every year, Joseph Grima and his partner who run Alcova, which is essentially, they run this as their own part of the furniture fair, the Milan Salone. But what they're also doing is that they're finding abandoned spaces, old villas, old factory buildings, and they're using these as the site for exhibition. This may seem like a very obvious idea, and obviously there's a certain amount of, what we call kind of ruin porn, placing beautiful objects in old spaces that make them really look kind of fabulous. But they are using that as a means of regenerating parts of the city that have been forgotten, because that kind of cultural capital, the world of kind of bringing people in from all over the globe who are there to basically buy furniture, and exposing and reinvigorating parts of the city has become part of a longer-term vision. So while we have all of these glossy people in their beautiful clothes in the sunshine of Milan, they are the people who then can generate the finance and the impetus to rejuvenate some of these spaces, into which are placed beautiful objects. I put this in here just because I quite like it. It's Junie Ishigami's very, very delicate kind of garden furniture. When we were walking around it, the people who were looking after the material would essentially look at you up and down and tell you whether you could sit down. So, you know, if you're too big, you weren't allowed to sit in a chair. So dubious about whether this is perhaps so robust. But also working with what we found. This is my favorite project, in fact, of Umberto's, Peter. It's very, very simple. It's just some ducting with a cushion. So again, what we work with, how we stay light on the ground, how we actually intervene in a temporary way. And I think those kind of temporary interventions, the understanding of how we can have some agency within the shaping of an environment, in this case, how we understand the domestic environment as really just pieces of furniture, even in the context of a kitchen, how we place ourselves lightly and temporarily within space, and how those temporary interventions can be extraordinary, can be beautiful, can be sensitive. This is the work of Sam Chimaev, again, in Milan in 24, and of Asif Khan. So these are often the same characters I'm bringing up over and over again because I think that they are articulating a position at different scales in different contexts, which I find useful and interesting. Where we work, if I come back to this idea of care, responsibility, of craft, of understanding, which are the sort of, the tripod upon which I think any good practice, any good teaching sits. The practice Tenzontle, which is now primarily Carlos Matos, is working in Mexico and Mexico City, and somehow their work comes out of the ground. It emerges like the earth. It is bound, it is colored, it is dense in the way in which the environment shapes it. And out of that also, there's an understanding that one can fabricate at the opposite end of the world of Chrysalis and Mike Davies, with the heaviness of casting, with the heaviness of rammed earth, and with a sensitivity to place. So what these two have been doing is creating projects that are both architecture at the wider scale, but also objects that are redolent of a kind of architectural idea, that are part of a kind of Mexican traditional myth-making, of a vernacular language that is translated into something unrecognizable. And I think that this is a kind of nuanced example of the way in which even the careful making of an object, the fabrication of a sculpture, a pavilion, an installation, is a proxy for our architectural thinking. It has value, it has importance, it is part of a conversation that pulls things just a little bit further forward. And of course, this is something that I feel like is starting to take shape in projects in mainland China as well. We had a wonderful lecture by Zhu Pei at the AA not long ago, and I just pulled this up because this idea of placeness, of localism, and the understanding that history is starting to play an increasingly important part in the way in which we fabricate work. So I've suggested here, so it's a slightly long sentence here. So I said, making can be a form of regeneration and create asset value, which I'll come back to in a second. But at a moment of shift between manual and digital fabrication, how do you cultivate skill? So if I've talked about the way in which we move forward, the way in which the tinkerers of the 1940s and 50s became the high-tech architects of the 70s and 80s, and that the new generation of architects are embracing the light and the heavy, the familiar, the adventurous, the digital, and the analog, to what extent do we understand how to make well, and how making well underpins all of these movements? I think the people who are perhaps the most interesting and perhaps producing the most extraordinary work are those who are both working in the physical and the speculative. They're working with image, they're crossing over between an understanding of the way in which we interact with the digital realm and that's impact on the physical. It's a project by Space Popular. We were talking about Frederick Peter just earlier, just a few hours ago. This in some ways it's called Search History. So it is a kind of physical pavilion that reflects the way in which we look for information, the way we source images. There's a playfulness to this. It's, in some cases, perhaps it's absurd. But what's interesting is that it is understanding the value of what you do on your phones, on your laptops, every day. The way in which you gather information, the way in which that information is layered, the way in which it affects your own creative production. And in this case, it is made into a physical space that has its own value. It's not simply another digital environment, but it's understanding how those images layer and become something new. And I think the work that they're doing has that level of provocation. There's also an incredibly important crossover between digital technologies and actual fabrication. The work of Arthur Mamuani, he's largely working within kind of computational design, but is translated directly into timber fabrication. So this is the steaming and bending of timber that is kind of pre-planned and digitized to a large extent through kind of computational thinking. And perhaps his kind of most exuberant expression of this is his pavilion temple Galaxia for the Burning Man Festival back in 2018. So again, this is essentially a kind of piece of computational design that then goes down to one-to-one construction. Because I'm sure, as you know, at Burning Man, these have to be projects that there's no infrastructure to bring in heavy machinery. So these things have to be made by people. And the fact that you can make something that, I suppose has reflections of the world of, Design Research Lab, of Zaha Hadid, etc., to be built out of small pieces of timber in the middle of the desert, is an interesting kind of question of the relationship between the digital and the analog. I showed you previously the work of Adam Nathaniel Furman. This is through his work with ceramics. This is a digital realm. So this is a kind of an idea about a new town hall. Whether something like this will be built or not, to me, doesn't really matter. I think that there's an understanding that these spaces make the extraordinary and the visionary and the I suppose, over-the-top idea of ornamentation a possibility, even if that remains within the digital realm. And then going back down to the way in which these kind of fictive environments kind of keep influencing the way in which we think differently. This is a student who finished many years ago in Emergent Technologies, a postgraduate program. She has gone on to really look at how you create or recreate or interpret found historical artifacts, biological artifacts. She does a lot of work with mushrooms and other organic material, and creates these extraordinary, in this case, kind of column capitals that speak to a kind of a new realm. She also is looking at the way in which 3D printing can create fabric and new technologies, kind of movable, flexible materials for clothing, and then also for potentially for building components. And then she's found her niche going back to Chrysali's project, where she gets a lot of opportunity to experiment because she works within the film industry. She teaches at UCLA, and then she was the one who developed all of this kind of ornamental jewelry and headgear for the Black Panther movie in 2019. And this brings me on to, there's always this elephant in the room about AI. And I mentioned this earlier, and this question of what AI does for us, what the opportunities are for understanding it just as another form of collective thinking. But I think this also taps into the way in which all of you interact with the built environment and the digital realm. So much of what you do now is shared by all. Not to sound really, really ancient, but when I was young, the biggest obligation was to look different and to find bands that no one else had heard of. So this kind of idea of total originality was, the absolute primary objective of a teenager back in the day. Now we share everything. Not only do we share the same cultural environment, but then when we have it, we share it with everybody else. So what is the future of an advanced digital environment? What does that look like? Are we going back in time, or are we going forward? This is an image from Bergdorf Goodman in 1929, when if you wanted to buy clothes, you would go into the shop and they would be People would come to you and they would understand what you wanted, and models would come in wearing those clothes, and you would have this private, very individualized experience. Now, to a large extent, if we think of the way in which things like fashion actually are at the background to our thinking, the idea of individualized experience, individualized diets, individualized stylists, the way in which AI steps in to try and understand us better than the way in which we can understand ourselves, is important to the way in which we also think of an architectural future. Recently, in a book launch by René de Graaf, he has a chapter in his new book on AI. And it's absolutely hilarious. I read it aloud to my partner last summer and was laughing out loud to the whole thing. Because the guy was, they're working on a project in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, and he's like, the client is saying, haven't got the DNA. It doesn't look like Jeddah. And so years down the line, the project evaporated, and he tried to put it into an AI engine, OMA building Jeddah. And the things that he comes up with are hilarious. And he concludes that actually AI is going to be about taste. It's going to be about this kind of superimposition of a kind of wallpaper of taste, of style, onto the surface of architecture. But I disagree, and I think that this is an important thing to begin to consider, that AI is not just about image making. It's not just about creating something glossy and a bit banal. It's actually potentially about the way in which we understand things differently, the way in which we are able to sustain incompatible information, the way in which we can understand layered intelligences, the way in which actually some of those ambiguities can become a mode of provocation and invention. I also think there's a potential for this kind of cluster of knowledge to help us think differently, because we make certain assumptions. Again, this might seem a little tangential, but it's on my mind. I was, in 2 weeks' time, meant to go to Dubai for the Dubai Art Fair, Art Dubai, and obviously that's not happening. Now, the way in which a place like Dubai has become, I suppose, there's other cities that now have eclipsed it, but the sort of apotheosis of new building, of the possibilities of infinite finance, of infinite energy, of infinite possibility, the tallest, the biggest, the shiniest, the kind of new land reclamation, spaces that are only really seen from an airplane. It's kind of like it's the anything goes of architectural space. And this is what we come to understand. This is the space of the Burj Khalifa, the KFC, the photographs, the waterfalls, the extraordinary kind of energy consumption of places that are basically in the desert. But what's interesting about this, and is incredibly important, is that the Gulf region, although it's experiencing a huge and historical upheaval, the average age is lower than 30. So this is an environment that is central to the way in which we may have to understand the future. And how is that future changing? So beyond the image, beyond the extraordinary projects, we also have a region that has deep historical and kind of cultural heritage. This is a project that is being developed by Ahmed and Rashid bin Shabib with Muji, that is about a heritage of a place we think of having no heritage. We think Dubai is entirely new. We think Dubai is without a climate, but it is not. These exhibitions are something about understanding what sustainable living is within a context of newness, within a context of nature, of landscape, of diversity that we're not familiar with, that we assume is not the case. Now, we all project images, and their choice is to project an alternative image of the Emirates. This, as you know, you're familiar with Instagram. These are just screenshots from their various stories that are about their project with Muji, about the opening in Tokyo, about the the sunrise or the sunset over the highway, of the mountains and the desert. This is building a new vision. And just this morning I was looking, and there's the UAE is trying very hard to preserve an image of peace and tranquility, although we know that it's experiencing quite the opposite. It is also at a moment where it is celebrating the fact that it is not an oil country. Its basis of its wealth is elsewhere, and it is trying extremely hard to build this as a kind of cultural world. I'll move on from some of this. So Sharjah, Art Dubai, etc., is a new way in which people are trying to frame the questions around design and architecture and new thinking. This sits at the opposite end of the spectrum to the world of NEOM, of the line, of the work in kind of Saudi Arabia. Obviously, this leaves us with the question of resource. We are living in an environment on a globe that is enormously constrained. We still, I think that if I look at the work of the new Pritzker Prize winner, Smiljan Radic, whose work is beautiful, but boy, does he use a lot of concrete, you know? And it's very hard to get away from it. You know, it's hard to be sculptural without concrete, but we need other answers. I think that the possibilities that are offered through digital realms that make us feel that anything is possible, we then need to get our hands dirty. We need to understand what care looks like. We need to understand not just how to make things well by hand, but to make things with care even in the digital realm. The ideas that we put out there have power. They have possibility. And with that, I think that we need to embrace those possibilities with the responsibility as educators as well. The interesting thing is that this is what we think of Saudi, this is also Saudi. There's a big move to kind of understand the UNESCO heritage listing of some of these historic sites, and the way in which actually people move away from the idea of luxury and consumer behavior to something simpler. I think I put this in, obviously, this is a piece known better to you than perhaps to I, a beautiful thing that feels both sensitive to sight, to material, and to fabrication, moves between the digital and the real, the ability to bring them together, the possibility of making by hand in multiple places where people can make for themselves, this being a series of terracotta tiles that come to make up a wall that is made out of jute. The jute experiment was done in South Korea, and the terracotta in sub-Saharan Africa. These are the possibilities of newness. This is the possibilities of how we also approach education differently. This is a little snapshot, and this is one of my final slides, and then I'll open to questions. But just last year, we welcomed our first cohort of master students in the Conservation and Reuse program. This is a program that is really close to my heart because I want to think about how we deal with what we already have. I tried to make the program called Existing Things of Relative Value, but the people who are leading it thought that might be a bit complicated. But I still think that's its true name. How do we attribute value to what we have? How do we attribute value to buildings, to landscapes? And how do we make sure that we invent and open the door to the outliers? So these three images, first the Conservation Reuse Program, which I call everything from cathedral to car park. You have to work out where the value is held, to the landscapes of this project in Thailand, to this funny little work of installation by Sam Chimaev, which is a sauna in a car. We work across a variety of scales. We don't always have to be sensible, but we have to understand the value and the impact of the work that we produce. Hopefully, yes. And lastly, this is an image from Hook Park. The AA is privileged to not only have its London site, but to have this quite empty 300-acre woodland in Dorset, which is about 3 hours away from London. And there, Kate Davies and Emmanuel Vercruz are embarking on an incredible project that advances ideas of what a forest might look like in 100 years, how we plan for climate change, and then how we use new technologies to make things out of natural materials. So down at Hook, there is 3D scanning, there's drone scanning to understand how to use every part of a tree, how to work with round timber, how to create joints that are pre-planned through computational design, robots that can cut trees with minimal intervention to make those joints that are unique. So how we can bring together these highly technological techniques to the world around us as it is, and to make the world anew. And for me, all of these things are an avant-garde. All of these things are a craft or a care or a form of responsibility. And as an educator, these again are the underpinning, are the foundation of everything I think is important. The only way that we can experiment is through the rigorous challenging of what is around us, and to do so responsibly and with respect. I hope that is a good synopsis of where I stand, where I hope the AA stands, and where I hope some future of education may be going. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Schroder, for this inspiring and provoking lecture. You have given us not only a historical perspective, but also a critical lens on where architecture practice and education might go next. Although I think we can continue the discussion on education this afternoon during the seminar after the break. Do join us, please, on 3:30. But we still have some minutes for some burning questions. So if you have any question, please raise up your hand. Our colleagues will pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. I just kickstart, and I think it's a message also for all the students who are here. When Ingrid and I were studying, there were two words that the teacher that we were taught by, Peter Carl, continuously mentioned to us, which were reciprocity and ambiguity. And I think what you're trying to do fits with these two words. Reciprocity is sometimes a misunderstood word, but I think today you've tried, and for me very successfully, explained what an architecture of reciprocity is. We have to teach, but we also have to take, and we have to give. And I think that's very beautiful, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
That was just a comment.
I thought you were going to say praxis.
Adam.
Any questions? Oh.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question a little bit about speculative work and things that are imagined. And I feel like this is something that we're returning to at a similar time to the dawn of computational design as well, where at least I could get away with drawing things that I couldn't necessarily translate into the built environment as objects and assemblies and all the things. Could you maybe reflect a little bit on how much room there still is for that kind of imagined future, unbuildable kind of design work before we get into the realities of how that gets translated through CNC devices and all the things a little bit?
Yeah, no, this is incredibly important to me, because I think not everything needs to be built. And if I go back to the last point, certainly we've built quite a lot already. Maybe about a year and a bit ago, I was in a DRL presentations, and Patrick's unit does a lot of work. Last year they did in the metaverse, which is a sort of abandoning, that project's being sort of largely shelved. And it was at the time of the LA fires, and at the time my niece was being evacuated, and I was very worried. And I remember thinking, why are we... Actually, Mike Davies was in the audience. He said, why have you got stairs in essentially your digital environment? You could do anything. And I thought, if we could do anything, can we not also contain, not necessarily in physical space, but in digital 3- and 4-dimensional space, memory, objects? At the time, my niece was in the process of a cancer diagnosis, so medical information, all of those things that hold us together, that create realities that are kind of intangible. And I think in some ways, the possibility of speculation through computational design is also almost that dreamlike space that actually someone like Jeff Kipnis was picking up at the very beginning of that computational idea that, I hate to say ambiguity in probably the opposite way in which Peter Carl is talking about it, but the ambiguity and irrationality of the digital realm is something that can stay digital, or can stay visual, or can stay unrealized, because it is an essential part of the way in which we understand the world. Arguably, I think Zaha's paintings are a lot more valuable in 100 years' time than many of her projects, because they express something impossible. but they express something of our experience of life that is even more essential. So that's where I think speculation has a really important role and has to sit alongside the CNCs and the physical fabrication. So, and I think the schools are where it also needs to be given space, because I think it's also kind of the world-building environments, even if we're talking about gaming technologies and animated film, that's part of our architecture. And it's certainly the way in which people understand the future. And it also then actually has quite a strong influence on the future. So hopefully it answers the question up to a point.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ingrid. It's so nice to hear an overview of the AA here. I want to go back to where you were saying about avant-garde as finding ways to free us from what's around us or liberate us from what's around us. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how to establish a sufficient understanding of what's around us, especially in today's all these conflicts. We don't seem to share the same reality.
It's really tricky because I don't think we ever did. I think this is the complexity of the human condition. I was speaking to an alumni from the AA who, this is a very long story, I'll get around to answer your question. I was talking about how, because sort of Zaha's on my mind, I have to write something about her in the next day or two. And so I pulled up her academic record. Amazing. And she was going through what a lot of our students are going through right now, which is that she was having trouble getting her tuition fees out of Iraq. Her written essays were stuck in Lebanon and the civil war had broken out. She was suffering from physical illness and tremendous anxiety. This is pretty typical. So, and then I told this to someone I was at lunch with, and he said, yeah, I remember 79 at the AA, and there were physical fights in the bathrooms between people supporting the Shah and people supporting the revolution. So this state of conflict, this state of misunderstanding, this state of different position taking has always been there. But if I reference your own work, so Cyan and Chen have done some amazing work and beautiful exhibition at the AA and a series of talks, but in many ways your work is both propositional and ethnographic. So you are using knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge and the description of knowledge as a form of speculation. So I think the two then advance together. So through the advancement of an understanding of a condition and of the existing, you are always providing a lens, and that lens is always speculative within the context of your own work. And I think that's a very interesting model for how we look at the existing ambiguities and irreconcilable differences of viewpoint. It's important.
Thank you for that. I totally didn't expect you to answer my question with our own work.
Yeah, there you go. You've answered it yourself through what you do every day.
Okay, so we can have one more question.
Hello, Ingrid. Yeah, thank you very much. I was going to leave this question until a little bit later in the education session. But I guess it's actually amazing, and thank you very much for sharing the work, your work with the AA. Yeah, I was chatting with my colleague, Leon, here. We both used to teach like second-year undergraduate, incoming students. And that's a question that I always think about, like, how do we start, or where do we start into, like, as a researcher, I go into look into, like, the latest technology and the latest things available. But I guess that question going back to when we're working with younger students, even though I can't really say that because they probably know more than us about technology already, but that question of where do we start? Where do we bring this? I think it's actually more important to bring this idea or this way of thinking, as you mentioned about the avant-garde, to them. Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to hear your insight about working with, like, younger students, or how do we start, basically?
It's really tricky because I think, Peter, you're asking about first year at the AA, and first year at the AA is tough. It's like people cover a lot. I mean, how to draw, how to make, how to understand context, how to work with case studies. I mean, it's the toughest year. everything they need to know they kind of learn in first year, and then the rest is, you know, play. Hard play, but play. I find the work of second-year students the most interesting in the school, hands down. It's the place they have the most freedom. It's the space that they actually don't know enough to paralyze themselves. And I think that they work with more exuberance than anybody else. But they've had a good grounding in, you know, the basics. And they've, you know, I think even Monia calls it boot camp, you know. So they've had boot camp, and then this is the moment where they're not told how to think or what to do. And out of that freedom, they do extraordinary things. And we had a project, whether you think it's a sensible one or not, from a student who essentially built a tower above the British Museum of packing cases. But, you know, her models were like this big. She was only this big. And then the drawings, the intensity, the devotion of these folded images, the imagination was just extraordinary. But also nobody said, that's stupid. And, you know, she's now further up the school, and she's doing perhaps more realized or realizable aspects of architecture. Because, you know, you can stunt people's imagination really easily. And it's very, very hard to stimulate it. It's like parenting, no? Basically. And we can resume this, yeah. Ed, I think Edward's got a question.
Hi, Ingrid. Edward here. I asked this question more than 10 years ago to somebody called Cook, but I don't think he answered properly, so I may as well ask you again. When do you think was a time in the history of AA that people was at the center of concern when it creates?
When in the history of the AA?
Yes.
Yeah.
So since
Edward, I'd say that depends on the unit.
When was the time and what had happened?
Oh, thank you, Edward. That's friendly. Yeah, so first of all, the AA has never been about one thing. And I think if you're familiar with the unit system, you'll know that there is a great diversity of the way in which people approach things. I would say a week and a half ago, we had a thing with Sue Rogers. She was looking at housing, she was looking at community, she was looking at schools. She was doing this at the same time as you had Rem Koolhaas and you had Peter Cook. I would say the Peter Cooks and the Rem Koolhaases, maybe not so interested in that kind of people. But at the same time, there were plenty of people who were. Plenty of people who were. Now, if you think that everyone thinks Alvin Boyarsky invented the unit system started in the 30s. And if you go back and you read, I think it's Summerson's review that he wrote of the projects review, all of that was about community spaces, housing. It was about new towns. It was a reaction post-World War I of some of the most inventive people that were looking at just this. There has always been a group that have done this. I would say Carlos's unit is still doing this. I think that we have 3 or 4 participatory practice units in the school. We're a plural environment. I would say, and this is an important thing, that the AA is often associated with the architects who shout the loudest. And those who shout the loudest aren't always interested in people. Are we stopping there?
No, I just checked with it. He's happy with the answer. Okay, if we have more question, I think please bring them to the seminar this afternoon at 3:30. Okay, and see you there. Thank you again, Professor.